The CIA spent millions in the 1960s on Operation Acoustic Kitty, where they surgically implanted listening devices into a cat to spy on the Soviets. The first mission ended when the cat got hit by a taxi right outside the target building. They literally turned a cat into a walking recording device, and it died within minutes of deployment. The project cost $20 million and produced zero intelligence. But here's the thing. This isn't even close to being the weirdest thing they've declassified recently. We're talking about government projects so bizarre that you'll question whether we're living in a simulation. And some of the most ridiculous ones happened just last year. The Great Pigeon Surveillance Scandal. Take the CIA's actual animal surveillance programs from the 1960s. They spent millions on Operation Acoustic Kitty, surgically implanting listening devices into cats for espionage missions. But that wasn't their only attempt at turning animals into intelligence assets. They also experimented with pigeons, training them to carry tiny cameras for reconnaissance missions over Soviet territory. The pigeon program was called Operation Decana, and it was completely real. CIA operatives actually spent months training pigeons to fly specific routes with miniature cameras strapped to their bodies. The birds were supposed to photograph Soviet shipyards in Leningrad where they built advanced submarines. Someone in the CIA looked at pigeons and thought these flying rats could be the future of intelligence gathering against the Soviet Union. The training process was exactly as ridiculous as you'd imagine. CIA agents who normally dealt with international espionage suddenly had to become pigeon experts. They learned about bird psychology, flight patterns, and how to attach surveillance equipment without affecting the pigeon's ability to fly. The agency hired actual pigeon trainers as consultants, which means there are government receipts somewhere for professional pigeon handling services in the covert operations budget. These agents had to figure out how pigeons think, which is apparently not much beyond finding food and getting home. The birds had one job: fly to the target, take pictures, and return to base. But pigeons don't understand concepts like national security or Soviet submarine technology. They understand seeds and not getting eaten by cats. The CIA developed detailed operational procedures for their feathered spies. They created flight route maps, weather consideration charts, and backup protocols for when pigeons inevitably went off course. Someone actually wrote technical manuals explaining optimal camera placement on pigeon bodies and troubleshooting guides for when the birds decided to ignore their training completely. The field tests revealed what any pet owner could have predicted. Pigeons are not reliable intelligence assets. They get distracted by food, they follow other pigeons instead of their assigned routes, and they have absolutely no concept of operational security. The CIA discovered that pigeons trained to fly to specific locations will happily fly somewhere completely different if they spot something more interesting along the way. During one test mission, a pigeon equipped with expensive surveillance equipment was supposed to photograph a target building. Instead, it spent an hour circling a park where someone was feeding birds. The resulting footage showed nothing but blurry shots of breadcrumbs and confused park visitors wondering why a pigeon was wearing what looked like a tiny backpack. Another pigeon managed to completely ignore its target and instead documented an entire outdoor wedding ceremony. Intelligence analysts had to review hours of footage showing a bride, groom, and wedding party from above while searching for any relevant information. The mission report noted that the pigeon provided comprehensive documentation of civilian celebration activities with no intelligence value whatsoever. The program required serious government oversight because of the budget involved. Congressional representatives had to sit through briefings about America's pigeon intelligence capabilities. There are actual hearing transcripts where elected officials asked questions like how to prevent enemy agents from shooting spy pigeons and what happens when the birds get distracted by food sources. The CIA wasn't alone in these animal experiments. The NSA developed their own catalog of surveillance devices that reads like science fiction. They created USB implants called cottonmouth that could be surgically placed in various animals for intelligence gathering. The The technical specifications describe devices so small they could be implanted in creatures as tiny as ants, turning insects into walking surveillance equipment. These programs generated mountains of paperwork. Every pigeon had its own operational file with training records, performance evaluations, and behavioral assessments. Someone actually wrote performance reviews for birds, rating their surveillance potential and mission reliability. The files contain phrases like Asset P7 shows navigational promise, but requires additional motivation training, and recommend reassignment due to persistent attention deficit behaviors. The documentation includes detailed risk assessments that seriously considered scenarios like pigeon defection to enemy forces, equipment malfunction during critical operations, and civilian adoption of surveillance assets. They developed contingency plans for every possible pigeon-related operational failure, which turned out to be most of them. The most absurd aspect was the bureaucratic seriousness applied to fundamentally ridiculous concepts. These programs had proper organizational charts, budget allocations, progress reports, and quarterly reviews. Someone convinced government officials that training pigeons for espionage missions deserved the same administrative structure as legitimate intelligence operations. The Pigeon surveillance program perfectly demonstrates how government bureaucracy can transform any idea, regardless of its practical merit, into a properly documented, officially supervised multi-million-dollar initiative. The fact that it failed completely was apparently less important than following correct procedures while failing. The CIA's creative approach to surveillance stemmed from a fundamental misunderstanding of animal behavior. The operational manuals include behavioral studies that any bird owner could have provided for free. Pigeons like food, they want to return home, and they have no interest in international espionage. These basic facts somehow required extensive research and millions of dollars to discover. The declassified files read like someone adapted a nature documentary for military use. There are technical diagrams showing camera placement on bird anatomy, flight pattern analyses that resemble elementary school science projects, and operational protocols that treat pigeons like tiny feathered soldiers who could be trained to follow complex mission parameters. The entire animal surveillance program represents the intersection of Cold War paranoia and bureaucratic overreach. Intelligence agencies were so desperate for innovative surveillance methods that they convinced themselves animals could be transformed into reliable intelligence assets. The results proved that nature doesn't care about national security objectives. But animal surveillance wasn't the strangest direction government agencies took their creative thinking. They were just getting started with ideas that would make pigeon spies look completely reasonable by comparison.